During my last video update, I mentioned system integrity protection and that you should only mess about with it if you know what you're doing. So just what is SIP and why is it potentially so hazardous? If we dive into the underpinnings of Mac OS, we'll find that it's based on BSD Unix, and just like any Unix-based operating system, it has a superuser account called root, which has an elevated set of permissions that allow it to do things to the computer's file system, such as changing the ownership of files for other users, and is the only account that's allowed to modify the root directory of the file system itself. Now in general, when we create an account on the Mac, we create one with admin permissions. Now that allows us to do a lot, but not everything that root can. To add an additional layer of security to your Mac, you should really create an everyday working account which only has standard permissions. And that means that not only can't you do admin things by accident, since you can't change certain settings with a standard account, but also if you should suffer a malware infection, then because it will be running under your account, it can do less damage than if it infected an admin one. Now even if we are using an admin account as our day-to-day account, there will still be some things that we can't do, as they're reserved for the root user. By default on Mac OS, the root user is actually disabled, so you can't just log in as root and cause serious havoc. However, we are able to temporarily acquire the root user's permissions using a command line instruction called sudo, essentially superuser do, or do this as the superuser. The root user account remains though, and potentially, if a nefarious process were to gain root permissions, then essentially all bets are off as to how compromised your system will be. How can that happen? Well, the very first process that starts when macOS boots up is called kernel_task, and that runs with root permissions. This then spawns a process called launchd, which also runs as root, and which launches all the other processes that make up macOS. You may have already realised that if a piece of malware is able to craft a way to get itself to be launched by root, then it can have root permissions and so do anything that it wants. With OS X El Capitan, Apple introduced system integrity protection in order to add another line of defence against not only malware but also users with enough knowledge to know how to become the root user, but not enough nous to take the warning that you get the first time you issue a sudo command seriously. SIP stops anyone, and that includes the root user, apart from Apple, from modifying the following directories. So how is it that Apple can change files in these directories but you can't? Quite a simple method that relies on an installer being signed by Apple's own certificate authority. So if the installer is signed by Apple, then it has permissions to make changes to those directories, and if it isn't, it can't. The directories that I mentioned are defined in one of two configuration files on your Mac, which detail the complete list of files and directories which are protected, as well as one which lists processes which cannot be unloaded or stopped. If you look into those files, you will see that the core applications which are installed as part of Mac OS are all protected, meaning that you can't delete them, even if you do log in as the root user. As well as protecting certain files and processes from being changed, SIP also prevents kernel extensions, or KEXTs, which have not been signed with a certificate specially issued to a developer ID for signing KEXT, from being installed. And the release of SIP caused issues for a number of developers who developed code which modified or added to part of the Mac's kernel, the core of Mac OS, in what had previously been a supported way. Initially, some developers advised their users to simply disable SIP so that they could continue to use their software. Now that's a bit like telling you to leave your car unlocked and with the key in the ignition so that you could have the convenience of someone coming along and valet parking it for you. And that's all well and good until somebody pretends to be the valet and makes off with your car. A more appropriate response, and one which the majority of developers have now taken, is to implement code changes in ways that don't require SIP to be permanently disabled. Yes, it's a bit of an inconvenience that they had to do it, but features like SIP help to make macOS and iOS among the most secure day-to-day operating systems available. When I did the Bluetooth upgrade on my MacBook Pro, I was careful to only disable SIP when I needed to, and made sure that I re-enabled it straight away afterwards. I unlocked the system, made my changes, and then locked it back up again. So how do you disable SIP? Well, I think I'll leave that to you and your favourite search engine. After all, it would be remiss of me to simply tell you how to remove a critical layer of security from your Mac without checking that you actually understood what you were doing first.